Family Alert. This segment of Prime Family Alert focuses on having consequences with bite. Establishing reasonable expectations for your children in all aspects of their lives, including school, home, and family, is essential for raising children who are responsible, respectful, successful, and happy. But expectations without consequences are like a dog with a loud bark but no bite. Scary at first, but ultimately harmless. Consequences are what cause your children to live up to your expectations. Now, I don't expect you to actually bite your children to get them to behave appropriately, even though you sometimes would like to. Nor does using that metaphor intend to suggest that the consequences you create should hurt your children in any way. But the consequences you connect to your expectations should be just unpleasant enough that when they're confronted with the option of living up to or failing at your expectations, they decide that the benefits of doing what you expect outweighs the costs. Unfortunately, these days, many parents seem to have a hard time with consequences at two levels. First, they don't establish any expectations at all, because that way they may actually have to enforce them at some point. Second, many parents establish consequences with the best of intentions, but they aren't good at following through. The reality is that playing the role of tough parent is difficult. It takes time when many families' lives are already overflowing with things to do. It takes energy that many harried parents may not have. Following through with consequences can also create conflict and ill feelings, interfering with the goal of many parents these days to be friends with their children, which, by the way, they shouldn't be in the first place. And kids these days are really good negotiators, possessing the ability to talk their parents out of administering the full consequence. Promises of better behavior in the future and demonstrations of love can seduce parents into letting their children off the hook. Another bad idea, I should say. And the bottom line is that not following through with the consequence is just the easiest and most expedient thing to do. Having consequences doesn't have to turn you into Kim Jong-il or a big green ogre, like Shrek without the cuteness. Consequences just mean that you're letting your children know that there are some pretty darn reasonable things, at least to someone who's not a child, that you expect of them, and that they must learn to become a functioning member of your family and our society. You can actually avoid the dictator or ogre labels by including your children in the discussion of expectations and consequences. Clearly state your expectations and establish and communicate the consequences of your children's meeting or not meeting those expectations. Explain why you're setting the expectations and the consequences so your children can see the benefit of acting in accordance with those expectations. This discussion helps ensure clear communication and understanding and encourages open dialogue between you and your children. In fact, ask your children for input into the process, particularly in coming up with fair consequences. If your children help create the consequences, they'll have a darn hard time arguing against them when they face your quote-unquote wrath because they fail to meet an expectation. This fairness also allows your children to justify their punishment when they don't meet the expectations and encourages them to internalize the expectations because the consequences are not so severe that they feel forced to comply. Consequences must also be meaningful to your children. They need to see the personal value of meeting the expectations. External benefits can include parental approval or receiving some predetermined reward, for example, receiving their allowance. Internal value can mean the intrinsic satisfaction of doing the right thing. If you explain the rationale behind the expectation, create a fair consequence, and emphasize that they have the power to choose whether to meet or violate the expectation, then they're more likely to live up to your expectations because they feel ownership of both the expectation and the consequence. Parents who enforce excessive or arbitrary consequences risk anger, resentment, and resistance in their children. If you establish a consequence that they view as harsh and extreme, your children may meet the expectation for a while out of fear of punishment, but will likely at some point rebel against it. Most harmfully, they won't internalize and accept the expectation as their own and will likely cease their efforts at meeting the expectations as soon as they're out of your control. At the same time, consequences that are insufficient for the transgression are equally ineffective. In other words, the punishment should fit the crime. You need to then firmly and consistently adhere to expectations and consequences that you establish. If you don't administer the consequence fully, your children will come to believe that the threatened consequences will not be meted out next time. Every time children are let off without a consequence for failing to meet an expectation, the value of the expectation is lost. In other words, your children must learn that you mean business. I'm Dr. Jim Taylor for Prime Family Alert.